Welcome to Tech Law Talks, a podcast brought to you by Reed Smith's Emerging Technologies Group. In each episode of this podcast, we will discuss cutting-edge issues on technology, data, and the law. We will provide practical observations on a wide variety of technology and data topics to give you quick and actionable tips to address the issues you are dealing with every day. Hello, this is Anthony Diana, a partner here in the Emerging Technologies Group at Reed Smith. Welcome to Tech Law Talks. Today will be the first part of a series with Lighthouse, focusing on what legal departments need to know about Copilot, Microsoft's new artificial intelligence tool. With me today are John Collins from Lighthouse and Kareem El-Hassan from Reed Smith. Thanks, guys, for joining. So today we really just want to give legal departments sort of at a very high level what they need to know about Copilot. As we know, Copilot was just introduced, I guess, like last fall, maybe November of last year by Microsoft. It was been in preview and the like. And I know a lot of organizations are at least contemplating the use of Copilot, or some of them I've heard have already launched Copilot without the legal departments knowing, which is an issue in and of itself. So today we just want to give a high-level view of what Copilot is, what it does at a really high level, and then what are the things that legal departments should be thinking about in terms of risks that they have to manage when launching Copilot. This will be at a high level of additional series, which will be a little bit more practical in terms of what legal departments should actually be doing. So today is just sort of highlighting what the risks are and what you should be thinking about. So with that, John, I'll start with you. Could you just give a very high-level preview of what is Copilot that's being launched?
Sure. Thanks, Anthony, for having me. So Copilot for M365, which is what we're talking about, is Microsoft's flagship generative AI product. And the best way to think about it is it's Microsoft, which has a partnership with OpenAI, has taken the ubiquitous ChatGPT and they've brought it into the Microsoft ecosystem. They've integrated it with all the different Microsoft applications that business people use, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Teams. And you can ask Copilot to draft a document for you, to summarize a document for you. So again, the best way to think about it is that it's taking that generative AI technology that everyone's familiar with ChatGPT and bringing it into the Microsoft ecosystem and leveraging a number of other Microsoft technologies within the Microsoft environment to make this kind of a platform available to the business people.
Yeah, and I think from at least from what Microsoft's saying, and I think a lot of our clients are saying that this is groundbreaking. This is going to be, and frankly, it's probably going to be the largest and most influential AI tool an enterprise has because Microsoft is ubiquitous, right? Like all your data is flowing through there. So using AI in this way should provide tons of productivity. Obviously, that's the big sell, but it is obviously everyone, if they get licenses for everybody, this is something that's going to impact, I think, most organizations pretty highly, just because it is, if you're using Microsoft M365, you're going to be dealing with AI at a, sort of on a personal level, large scale and the like. And I think that's one of the challenges we'll see. So Kareem, could you just give a little bit, John gave a very nice overview, just in terms of a few things that he said, in terms of, we've got this ChatGPT. What is it that's unique about Microsoft in terms of how it works from a technology perspective? Because I know a lot of people will be saying, I don't want people using ChatGPT for work.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. As opposed to kind of these publicly web-based ChatGPT tools, I think the big sell and what makes Copilot unique is that it's grounded in your enterprise's data, right? And so essentially it integrates with the Microsoft Graph, so which allows users within the enterprise to leverage their M365 data, which adds context. And so rather than just going to GPT-4, which is as everyone knows, trained on publicly available data and has its own issues, hallucinations and whatnot, having this unique enterprise specific data kind of adding context to inputs and outputs, leads to more efficiency. Another big thing and a big issue that legal departments are, obviously thinking about is that having this data input into the tool, one of the problems is that you're worried that it can, train the underlying models. With Copilot, that's not happening. The instance of the LLM in which the tool is relying on is within your service boundary. And so, that kind of gives protections that you wouldn't necessarily have when, people are kind of just using these publicly available tools. And so, that's, I think, the big differentiating factor with Copilot as opposed to, GPT for ChatGPT and, kind of these other public tools.
And I think that's critical. And John, obviously, I'll let you sort of expound on that too. But I do think that's a critical piece because I know a lot of people are uncomfortable using these large language models. Like you said, they're public. The way Microsoft built this product is you get in essence, your own version. So if you get the license, you're getting your own version of it and it's inside your tenant. So it doesn't go outside sort of your firewalls, like technically a firewall, but it's in your tenant. And I think that's critical. And I think that gives a lot of people comfort. And at least that's what Microsoft's saying.
Yeah, just a couple things to point out is some folks might be familiar with or heard about that Microsoft has this responsible AI framework where if you are using Azure OpenAI tools and you're building your own custom Chat GPT, but using the Microsoft or the Azure OpenAI version of Chat GPT, this responsible AI framework, Microsoft is actually retaining prompts and responses, and a human being is monitoring those prompts and responses. But that's in the context of a custom development that an organization might do. Copilot for M365 actually opted out of that. And so to Kareem and Anthony's point, Microsoft's not retaining the prompts for Copilot, the responses. They're not using the data to retrain the model. So there's that whole thing. The second thing I just want to point out is that you do have the ability with Copilot for M365 to have plugins. And one of the plugins is that when you're chatting in Microsoft Teams using the chat application, you have the option to actually send prompts out to the internet to further ground. Kareem talked about grounding the information in your organization's data. So there are some considerations around configuration. Do you want to allow that to happen? There's still data protection there, but those are a couple things that come to mind on this topic.
Yeah, and look, and I think this is critical, and I agree with you. I think that's there is a lot of, I don't want to say dangers, but there's a lot of risks associated with Copilot. I think, as you said, you really have to go through the settings to make sure. That is one that I think we've been advising clients at least to turn off for now, just because,
Yep.
and just to give clarity here, I think we're talking about prompts and responses. A prompt is in essence a question, right? It could be summarize the document, or you could type in, give me a recipe for blueberry muffins, right? You can type anything. It's a question through Copilot. So it's an app. You make that question. When we talk about grounding, right, I think this is an important concept for people to understand. When you're grounding on a document, so for example, if you wanted to summarize a document, right? We have a transcript of a meeting, right? You're like, okay, I want to summarize it. My understanding of the way it works is when you press summarize a document, what you're really doing is telling the tool to look at the document, use the language in that document to create, I'll call it a better prompt or question that has more context. Then that goes to the large language model, which is, again, inside the tenant. And then that will basically give you an answer, but it's really just saying the answer is, this is the likely next word is the best way to describe it. It's about probability and the like. So it doesn't know anything. It is just, when you're grounding it in a document or your own enterprise data, all you're doing is basically asking better questions of this large language model. That's my understanding of it. I know people have different types of descriptions, but that's the way I think the best way to think about it. And again, this is where we start talking about confidentiality, like why people are a little concerned about it going public. To the public part is that those questions, right, are going to take potentially confidential information, whatever, and send it to this outside model. If it wasn't Copilot, be out there. And this is true with a lot of AI tools. And you may not have control, like John, you said, of who's looking at it. Are they storing it there? How long are they storing it? Is it secure? All that stuff. That's the type of stuff that we normally worry about. However, here, because of the way Copilot is built, some of those concerns are less. Although, as you pointed out, John, there are features that you can go to the internet which could cause those same concerns. Any other flavor, Kareem or John, that you want to give? Again, that's my description of how it works, but
yeah, no, the thing I was going to say, no, I think you gave a great description of the grounding. Kareem had brought up the graph. So the graph is something which underlies your Microsoft 365 tenant, and Kareem alluded to this earlier. And essentially, when the business people in your organization are communicating back and forth, sharing documents as links, they're chatting in Microsoft Teams, sending emails. This graph is a database that essentially collects all of that activity. It knows that you're sharing documents with so-and-so. And that becomes one of the ways that Microsoft surfaces information for the grounding that Anthony alluded to. So how does Copilot know to look at a particular document or know that a document exists on a particular topic about blueberry muffins or whatever?
Yeah.
In part, that's based on the graph. And that's something that can scare a lot of people because it tends to show that documents are being overshared or people are sharing information in a way that they shouldn't be. So that's another issue, I think, Anthony and Kareem, that we're seeing people talk about.
Yeah, and that is a key point. I mean, the way that Microsoft explains it is Copilot is very individualistic, I'll say. So if it's based on, when you're talking about all the information can be grounded in, it's based on the information that someone has access to. And I think, John, this is the point you were saying, as we start going through these risks, one of the big challenges I think a lot of organizations are now seeing is Copilot is exposing, as you noted, bad access controls is the best way to describe it, right? Like a lot of people in M365, there's not a focus on it. So because people may have more access than they need, when you're using Copilot, it really does expose that. I think that's probably one of the biggest risks that we're seeing and the biggest challenges that we're talking to our clients about because it is limited to the access that the person has. There's a presumption that that person only has access to what they should have. And I think we all know now that's not the case. And I think that's one of the big dangers. And we'll talk about this in future episodes about how do you deal with that specific risk. But again, I think as we talked about it, that is one of the big risks that legal departments have to think about is, you should be talking to your IT folks and saying, what access controls do we have in place and the like, because that is one of the big issues that people have. So to give you, highlight it, you have highly confidential information within your organization. If people are using Copilot, that could be a bad thing because suddenly they can ask questions and get answers based on highly confidential information that they shouldn't be getting. So it is one of the big challenges that we have. One thing I want to talk about, Kareem, before we get into a little bit more on the risks is sort of the product level differences. I mean, we talk about Copilot as if it's one product, but I think as we've heard and seen, there's sort of different flavors, I guess, of Copilot.
Sure. Yeah. So as Anthony noted, Copilot is an embedded tool within the 365 suite, and so you're going to have Copilot for Word, Copilot for PowerPoint, and so there are different tools and there's different functionality within whatever product you're working within, and that of course is going to affect one, the artifacts that are created, some of the prompts that you're able to use and leverage. And so it's not as simple as just thinking as Copilot as this unified, product, because there are going to be different configurations. And I'm sure Anthony will speak to this. We've kind of noted that even some of the configurations around where these things are stored, there's certain gaps depending on whether you're using Outlook, for example. And so, you really have to dig into these product specific configurations because the risks do vary. And just to kind of add, and John kind of pointed to this, there is, one version of Copilot, which 365 Chat, I believe is what it's called. And that is probably the most efficient from a product perspective because it can leverage data across the user's, personal graph. And so again, bigger risks may be there than if you were looking at just kind of Excel. So, definitely product specific functionalities change. And so food for thought on that point.
Yeah. And John, I don't know if Lighthouse has done testing on each of these different applications, but what we've seen our clients do is actually test each application. So
Right.
You have Copilot for Word, Copilot for Excel, Copilot for Teams and stuff, because as Kareem said, we have seen issues with each. I don't know if you've seen anything specific that you want to raise.
Yeah, well, I think you guys bring up some really good points. I think for example, Outlook, the prompts actually don't get captured as an artifact versus in Word and Excel and PowerPoint. But then we're also seeing some interesting things in our testing. So we're doing ongoing testing. But when it comes to meeting summaries and the difference between recapping a meeting that only has a transcript versus a meeting that has a full recording, and the artifacts that get generated between the different types of meeting summaries, whether it's a recap or a full, what they call AI notes. So that we're seeing some the meeting recaps aren't being captured 100% verbatim. So there's a lot of variability there. And I think the key thing is that you pointed out, Anthony, is you got to do testing. You've got to test. You've got to get comfortable that you know what artifacts are being generated and where they're stored and whether you can preserve, collect all of those things.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about this generally, and John, I'm sure you're saying the same thing, is prompts and responses, or at least Microsoft is saying prompts and responses are generally stored in all these applications in a hidden folder in your in the person's Outlook, right? So their mailbox. As we noted and Kareem noted, for whatever reason, Outlook's prompts and responses aren't being saved there, although I'm told that fix is coming in. It may have been even this week. So that there was a gap. Obviously, it came out in November, so there's still gaps. And I think, as is true, everyone's doing testing. John's doing, like Lighthouse doing testing. I'm sure you're talking to Microsoft. Note these gaps. They're filling in the gaps. So it is a new product. So that's one of the risks that everyone has to deal with is if anybody telling you this is the way it works may not be absolutely correct because you have to test. And certainly you can't really rely on the documentation that Microsoft has because they're improving the product probably faster than they're updating their documentation. So that's another challenge that we've seen. So test is really important. So just some things to think about. Okay, we're almost out of time, so I won't get into too much in the risks, but I think we've already talked about at a high level some of the risks. As we've talked about, there's the confidentiality and access issues that you should be thinking about. Retention and over-retention we'll get into later, but there is obviously a risk. A lot of litigation teams are saying, I don't want to keep this around. People are asking these questions, getting responses, they not be accurate. From a litigation perspective, they don't want it around. There's not business case for it, business use for it. Because usually when you're doing this and you're asking to help draft an email or whatever, you're probably doing something with that data, even meeting transcripts. If you get a recap, some people are copying and pasting it somewhere just to keep it. But generally, the idea is the output of Copilot is usually sort of short term. So that's generally been the approach I think most people are taking and to get rid of it. But it's not easy to do because it's Microsoft. And so that's one of the risks. And I think as we talked about, there's going to be e-discovery risks, John, right? Like we're talking about, can we preserve it? Yep. There may be instances we can or can't. That's where the Outlook thing becomes an issue. As I think Kareem noted, hallucinations or accuracy is a huge risk. It should be better, right? As I think Kareem said, because it's grounded in your data, it should be better than just sort of general, but there's still risks, right? And there's a reputational risk associated with it. If someone's relying on a summary of a meeting and they don't look at it carefully, that's obviously going to be a risk, particularly if they circulate that this was said. So a lot of things to think about at a high level. Kareem and John, let's conclude. What are the risks that you're seeing that you think legal departments should be thinking about other than what I just said?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that legal departments seem to be struggling with, I'm sure you guys are hearing this, is that what about the content itself being tagged or labeled as created by generative AI?
Yeah.
There's actually some areas in M365, like meeting summaries, where it will say generated by AI, but then there's other areas like a Word document that was completely, the person creates a document, they do a very light touch review of it. The document's essentially 99% generative AI. A lot of companies are asking, well, can we get metadata or some kind of way to mark something as having been created by? So that's one of the things that, in addition to all the issues that you highlighted, Anthony, that we're hearing companies bring up.
Yeah. Kareem, anything else from your perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I think one big issue that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in future episodes is, with this kind of emergence of, this AI functionality, there's a tendency on behalf of users, to heavily rely on the outputs. And I know a lot of people kind of talk about human in the loop. And so, I heard somebody say, these are called copilots for a reason and not autopilot. And so the training aspect, really needs to be ingrained because when people do sit and rely on these outputs as if they're, foolproof, you can run into operational, reputational, risks. And so I think that's one thing we're seeing, that, the training is going to, be integral. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I'll finalize this just to think about, and this is really important for legal departments, think about privilege, right? If you're using Copilot and it's using privileged information, I know I've heard a number of GCs say, my biggest concern is waiver of privilege, because you may not know that you're using Copilot against privileged information. That's summarized in an answer, which is basically privileged, but you don't know it. And then it's circulated broadly and stuff. So again, there's a lot to consider. I think, as we've talked about, it's really about training and access controls and really understanding the issues. And like I said, in future episodes with Lighthouse, we'll be talking about some of the risks more specifically, and then what can you do to mitigate those risks? Because I think that's really what this is going to be about, is mitigating risks and understanding the issues. So, well, thanks to John and Kareem. I hope this was helpful. Like I said, we'll have future podcasts, but thanks everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll listen soon.
Tech Law Talks is a Reed Smith production. Our producers are Allie McCardle and Shannon Ryan. For more information about Reed Smith's emerging technologies practice, please email techlawtalks@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts. This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.